Luke Skywalker once remarked that if there's a bright center to the universe, Tatooine is the planet farthest from it. Despite this, Tatooine appears quite often in Star Wars media, finding itself relevant to galactic events far more than a backwater world of its kind would seem to merit. Contrary to the complaints of bored teenagers, Tatooine wasn't actually that obscure. It was considered a backwater world, but it was widely known and its spaceport saw regular traffic. Nonetheless, Tatooine was little populated and mostly barren, and its significance in galactic history was mostly a matter of luck or circumstance. Regardless of why it appears so often in Star Wars stories though, Tatooine's many appearances have given us an enormous amount of lore about the planet and its peoples, and in this video, we're going to be taking an exhaustively in-depth look at the legends lore of Star Wars' most well-known planet.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Tatooine was located in the Tatoo system, which lay at the center of the Outer Rim Territory's Arcanus sector. The Arcanus sector was pretty typical as far as Outer Rim sectors went, mostly a mix of backwater mining worlds, little-known Rhodian and Bothan colonies, and a handful of Hutt throne worlds, with some more reputable trading outposts thrown in for good measure. At the time of the prequel trilogy, the Arcanus sector was at least ostensibly part of the Republic, governed from Arcanus on the Corellian Run, a major trade route that ran along the sector's trailing edge. However, the Republic only really existed on Arcanus and its neighbors, a subsector known as the Regency Worlds, and most of the sector was instead controlled by the Hutt cartel. But just as it was located on the edge of the Republic's territory, the Arcanus sector was located on the periphery of the Hutt's sphere of influence as well, leaving most of the sector a sort of middle ground, close enough to civilization to be well known and well traveled, but remote enough to be largely lawless. Tatooine, which lay just barely on the Hutt's side of the unofficial border between the Republic and Hutt influence, embodied this middle ground lawlessness pretty well. The Tatoo system lay just off a smaller stellar void known as the Gulf of Tatooine at the junction of two major hyperspace routes, the Triellus trade route, a long outer rim route that ran around the rimward edge of Hutt space, and the old Corellian Run, the original final stretch of the Corellian Run, which fell into disuse when the Corellian Run was rerouted south. A third, less used route, the Crystal Passage, connected Tatooine to Geonosis and a string of rimward mining worlds. All three of these routes had long travel times and regular harassment from pirates and raiders, but they were nonetheless reliable, particularly the Triellus, which was often used by Hutts and their servants. As you surely know, the Tatoo system was a binary star system, and at its heart were two yellow dwarfs in an extremely close mutual orbit. These stars were known as Tatoo 1 and Tatoo 2. Tatoo 2 was roughly the same size and luminosity as our Sun, with a real-world spectral class of G25, while Tatoo 1 was a little larger and brighter, being a class G15. These stars were roughly the same size, though in some Star Wars sources, one of the two stars is depicted as being significantly smaller than the other, possibly due to the dynamics of Tatooine's orbit. Tatoo 1 and 2 were orbited by just 3 planets. Tatooine, a terrestrial world, was the innermost planet, while the gas giants Ohan and Adriana were located beyond it, with an asteroid field somewhere between the three worlds. Ohan had 3 moons, while Adriana had 4. Ohan was largely unremarkable, but Adriana had a thick ring of ice crystals which were scooped up by prospectors for transport to Tatooine, where the ice was melted down and purified for use as drinking water. Tatooine itself was orbited by 3 moons, all of them barren and lifeless. The largest and closest was Gomrasin, while the second largest was Guermessa. Both of these moons shone brightly in Tatooine's night sky. The third moon, Chenini, was small and had an erratic orbit that sometimes took it very far from Tatooine. In addition to these natural moons, a few artificial satellites were built over Tatooine over the years, though none were particularly noteworthy or long-lasting. Tatooine was a terrestrial planet with roughly standard gravity and a breathable nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere. It was a bit smaller than Earth is, with a diameter of 10,465 kilometers. A Tatooine day was 23 hours long, and a Tatooine year was about 304 local days. Tatooine had a tight orbit around its parent stars, and this, combined with the high reflectivity of its sodium-rich desert surface, meant that it shone brightly from orbit, so much so that original Republic surveys of the Arcanus sector mistook it for a star. It was an old planet, long past its prime, and most of its surface was uninhabitable, a barren wasteland of endless rolling sand. But it wasn't always this way, as the presence of a breathable atmosphere and life on its surface suggested. Though neither settler nor Jawa remembered a time when Tatooine was anything other than a desert, the legends of the indigenous sand people tell of ancient days when Tatooine was full of life, a world of warm seas and humid jungles, still hot but far from barren. In those days, the ancestors of the sand people and the Jawas, the Kumumga, had an advanced industrial civilization which built gleaming cities and eventually took to the stars. But this attracted the attention of a much greater interstellar civilization, an infinite empire ruled by a pitiless people the Sand People remembered as the Builders. The Builders conquered Tatooine and enslaved its people, exporting Kumumga slaves for use in various projects across the infinite empire. They turned Tatooine into a strip mine, digging up its natural resources for use in their war machine. The Kumumga's cities were torn down and hauled off, and the scrap was melted down in the Builders' war forges. But after centuries of occupation, the Builders were weakened by a plague, and the Kumumga saw their chance. They rebelled against the occupiers, sabotaging their ship and resource harvesting machines and fighting to drive them from Tatooine's surface. With the Builders weakened by the plague, the Kumumga were victorious, and the Infinite Empire was forced to abandon its occupation. As they did so, however, the Builders carried out an orbital bombardment of Tatooine, utterly destroying the planet's surface. Oceans were boiled away and the jungles burned to ash. Tatooine's once rich soil was melted into glass, which, over the millennia that followed, was ground down into sand. The planet was transformed from a thriving, living world to a barren desert, but the Kumumga survived. They had anticipated the bombardment and hidden their civilians in deep caves, where some of them were able to survive until the surface was habitable again. The same was true for a number of other species, flora and fauna alike. In the years after the bombardment, life slowly returned to Tatooine, but the planet was never as it was. The ancient legends of the Sand People were true. The Kumumga had been enslaved, and Tatooine had been glassed by the Rakata, the rulers of the ancient Infinite Empire. It's likely that the Sand People's version of the tale simplified some aspects. For instance, it was speculated by HK47 that the environmental destruction Tatooine suffered began before the bombardment as a result of the Kumumga's industrial activities and the Rakata's destructive strip mining, though the bombardment was certainly the final blow. Nonetheless, the core of the legend remains true. In the 25,000 years since the end of the Rakatan occupation, direct evidence of the bombardment vanished, but indirect signs of it remained. For instance, Tatooine was able to keep its pre-bombardment nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere despite the destruction of most of its photosynthesizers. This atmosphere was replenished by some of the life on the planet, but not at anywhere near pre-bombardment rates. The very existence of complex life on a desert planet, which would normally be very unlikely given that life generally requires liquid water, was another hint that Tatooine wasn't always barren. In the modern era, however, Tatooine was a hot, arid, and mostly desert world, geologically inactive apart from its molten outer core, with next to no surface water and an average humidity level of 5.4%. It was so hot that the vast majority of the planet was completely uninhabitable. Humans, and most other sentient species, could only survive in a single, small, relatively cool region in the far north of the planet, which was under 1,000 kilometers wide. Outside of this region, Tatooine was well and truly barren, with little to no macroscopic life and certainly no sentient beings. Even in the habitable region, life was hard. Water was still scarce and the noonday heat could still kill. Tatooine's climate and unforgiving twin suns were said to be so harsh that they could cause beings to age more quickly. Across all of Tatooine, both the habitable and uninhabitable parts, the terrain fell into one of two categories: the open deserts and the rocky uplands. The deserts consisted of vast tracts of endless, sodium-rich sand dunes which were regularly swept up into deadly sandstorms by strong winds. Even in the habitable region, these deserts were highly inhospitable to most life forms. Due to the high sodium content of Tatooine sand, most of these tracts of open desert were believed to have originally been the floors of oceans and other large bodies of water before the Rakardan bombardment. The open deserts within Tatooine's habitable regions, which were collectively known as the Dune Sea, were believed to have been the floor of an ancient inland sea. The Dune Sea wasn't as utterly uninhabitable as most of Tatooine's deserts, but it was nonetheless very inhospitable, and a human wandering the Dune Sea could die of dehydration in just half an hour if they entered the desert unprepared. Within Tatooine's habitable region, there were four main expanses of the Dune Sea, with smaller and less forgiving patches of desert between them. The largest was the Western Dune Sea, which made up the entire western portion of the habitable region. This vast expanse was dotted with the bleached bones of banthas, krayt dragons, and other creatures. The only refuges in the Western Dune Sea were a scattering of caves, as well as the settlements of the Sand People. On the other side of Tatooine's settled lands, in the northeastern portion of the habitable region, was the Northern Dune Sea. The southern edge of this desert was well traveled, but the Northern Dune Sea was still very dangerous. It made up much of the northern part of Tatooine's habitable region, though it was broken up in the south by a range of highlands. A part of the Northern Dune Sea, known as the Bantha Plains, was roamed by large herds of banthas. Directly south of the Bantha Plains was the southernmost region of the Northern Dune Sea, the Bomar Flats, which contained the Great Pit of Carkoon, home to Tatooine's legendary Sarlacc. The other two regions of the Dune Sea were located in the south of the habitable region, and they slowly transitioned into uninhabitable desert flats further south. One of these regions, located due south of Anchorhead, was just known as the Dune Sea. This stretch of the Dune Sea was home to populations of desert raid as well as Sand People tribes. East of this region was the last and most distant of the Dune Seas. The Eastern Dune Sea, a remote region that was prowled by krayt dragons and some of the fiercest Sand People tribes. The Eastern Dune Sea was also the location of ancient Rakardan ruins left over from the time of the Infinite Empire, which contained a star map, a powerful dark side artifact. Other stretches of Tatooine were covered by higher, rockier regions, believed to be all that remained of ancient land masses. These uplands were still barren and full of sand, but they were a bit more hospitable, as their shadowed canyons could provide shelter from the blazing suns. The rocky uplands of Tatooine were made up of weather-worn mountains, many riven by dramatic canyons, which were carved by ancient rivers, orbital bombardment, and tens of millennia of wind and sand. As a result of years of erosion, many of Tatooine's rocky regions had been shaped into dramatic, even picturesque formations, and their foothills were littered with caves and tunnels. Across most of Tatooine, the rocky uplands were cooler than the open deserts, but still uninhabitable. Within the habitable region, however, these were the parts of Tatooine where most of the planet's life stubbornly endured. The largest and most well-known upland region in the habitable area was the Junland Wastes, a range of mountains and mesas on the eastern edge of the western Dune Sea, home to sand people, Jawas, outlaws, and hermits, as well as crate dragons and other animals. Vast canyons wound their way through the Junlan wastes, while huge cave systems stretched beneath them. The Junlan wastes was divided into two subregions, a taller, more mountainous northern tract, and a flatter region of mesas in the south. The northern Junlan wastes contained the Hubba Heights, a high mountain range at the waste's northern end which was settled by a number of Jawa clans, while the southern Junlan wastes contained both the Jawa and Sand People settlements, the former at Jawa Heights and the latter at the Needles. The southern wastes also contained several dramatic rock formations, such as the Bethazasha Bridge. The two halves of the Junlan wastes were divided by a vast abyss known as the Wound, an exceptionally deep ravine created during the ancient bombardment of Tatooine. Other rocky regions in Tatooine's habitable zone included the Great Mesra Plateau, an enormous plateau on the southern edge of the Bomar Flats, and the Mospik Higher Range, the tallest mountain range on the planet, which was located further north. The two regions formed the southwestern wall of the northern Dune Sea, and together with the Junlan wastes, they enclosed a large desert basin that contained most of Tatooine's settled lands. This basin was sheltered somewhat from the extremes of the Dune Sea by the uplands, and of all the regions on Tatooine, it was the most suitable for life, though it was still extremely hot and largely barren. This region even contained a handful of oases, most notably Hika Oasis and Motesta Oasis, which were used as rest stops by settlers traveling through the region. These were among the only concentration of surface water on the entirety of Tatooine. The planet had a scattering of other freshwater sources, but they were all underground, and the Sand People jealously guarded many of them. Tatooine cities and towns imported most of their water from the rings of Adriana, while smaller, more remote settlers used moisture vaporators to harvest water from the air. In the borderlands between the uplands and the open deserts, there were also mists that rose just before the dawn. The nature of these mists was mysterious, but the leading scientific theory was that they came from veins of water trapped in sandstone beneath the desert sands, which rose to the surface as vapor when the ground cooled at night. Mists and oases aside, water was very scarce on Tatooine, and as a consequence, living things were as well. But there was life on Tatooine, and more of it than you might expect, sentient and non-sentient alike. We're going to start with the non-sentients, beginning by discussing Tatooine's flora. Tatooine may have seemed barren, but there were fungi and even plant life if one knew where to look. Tatooine flora was hardy and highly resilient, as it had to be to survive the planet's harsh conditions, and it was generally found only in the habitable zone. Most forms of Tatooine flora were small and found primarily in the uplands, such as the Junlan Waste. Examples include Puten grass, which was a rough, hardy desert grass that was used for bedding by some of Tatooine's inhabitants. Razor moss, which grew on the planet's rocks, breaking down sandstone to get its small veins of water trapped within. Desert sage, which grew out on the flats. Molo seeds, which grew underground, and funnel flowers, which grew in rock crags in the uplands, condensing their own moisture from the air. All of these plants were vital food sources for many of Tatooine's smaller animals. A few variety of Tatooine flora were edible by humans and other larger beasts. Among these were vaporator mushrooms, which grew most notably on moisture evaporators, which tasted terrible but were nutritious and were a key food source for moisture farmers. There were also desert plums, which grew underground in places where there was a high concentration of moisture in the atmosphere, and hubba gourds, which were hard for humans to digest but were the primary staple food of the Jawas and Sand People. Hubba gourds were melons that grew in recesses in the cliffs of Tatooine's rocky regions, elongated in shape and with a tough skin, which was yellow when ripe. The flesh of the gourd was stringy and bitter, and its juice was sour. Nonetheless, it was edible, and for Jawas it was the only food source they needed, as they had evolved to be able to subsist on hubbergourds alone. Though raw hubbergourds were considered unappetizing by most species, they apparently tasted better when roasted. Two varieties of edible fruit, deb and pikas, grew only around Tatooine's oases. Both were primarily used to make alcoholic beverages, though pikas, which had a sweet flavor, could also be eaten straight up. In addition to the directly edible plants, the flavorful leaves of the mannock plant, which grew in Tatooine's cooler grottos, were used as seasoning by the settlers. Other fruits, among them pallies, pod poppers, and lambta, were grown in hydroponic gardens by Tatooine settlers, though it's unknown if they were native to Tatooine or imported. Another notable Tatooine plant was the molo shrub, which grew in the canyons of the Junlan wastes. This plant appeared to be a simple desert scrub during the day, but at night it would bloom, unveiling a dazzling array of leaves and flowers. Tatooine was also home to the thorny cactus bush, as well as two varieties of tree, the Tatooine tree, which was gnarly, leafless, and exceedingly rare, found only in the deepest canyons, and the Jaipur tree, the wood of which was used for furniture and jewelry by the settlers. Now to move on to the more interesting part of Tatooine's ecology, the planet's fauna. Tatooine had quite a few prominent animal species for such a barren world, most of them restricted to the habitable north, ranging from small insects to enormous beasts. We won't be covering all of Tatooine's animal life for time's sake, and as a general rule, we're going to be discussing these creatures from smallest to largest, with exceptions. At the bottom of Tatooine's food chain were a few small species of insects, among them sandflies and parasitic burrowing creatures. These creatures fed on Tatooine's scant plant life, as well as garbage in the settlements in the case of creatures, and they served as the food sources for larger species. Small amphibians, called ibians, preyed on the smaller insects and were in turn preyed upon by larger creatures. Tatooine might seem like an odd place for amphibians to live, given how dependent amphibians are on bodies of water, but the ibians weren't even the only amphibians on the planet. Larger, frog-like gorgs were also found on Tatooine. These creatures preyed on ibians and came in a number of subspecies. Gorgs lived in burrows and were initially uncommon, but as Tatooine was settled, they quickly multiplied as they began to live in the sewers under the planet's cities, and some of the settlers began to breed them for food. Gorgs were a favorite food of the Hutts, as well as many of Tatooine's settlers. Many species of rodents called Tatooine home, among them profogs, which were small and considered vermin by moisture farmers. Profogs had sharp horns, teeth, and claws, as well as forked tails, and they primarily ate molo seeds, as well as whatever they could steal from the gardens of moisture farmers. They created enormous and highly complex burrows known as towns, where communities of up to 100 profogs would live. This practice made profogs a keystone species, as creedles, ibians, gorgs, and scurriers often made use of abandoned profog towns. Scurriers were another small rodent species common in the settled parts of Tatooine's towns. They lived essentially like rats, being scavengers that lived in packs and regularly infested starships, land speeders, and other transports, which spread them throughout the galaxy. Scurriers were bipedal and hopped to get around, with long tails and a set of horns on their heads. One of the most well-known Tatooine animals was the womp rat, a large species of rodent that could grow up to 3 meters in length. Womp rats were vicious creatures and widely disliked, to the point where bored teenagers among Tatooine settlers would use them for target practice. Womp rats often scavenged for their food, eating refuse or carrion, but they were also predatory, primarily preying on vulnerable creatures. Womp rats ate profogs and scurriers, and packs of them were also known to attack banthas and dewbacks, taking down the larger beasts with sheer numbers. The wolf-like anubas had similar hunting habits. These moderate-sized mammals had long tails and strong jaws, often hunting in packs of 10 to 12, primarily hunting large animals. While womp rats were despised, Anubas were often domesticated and kept as pets. The bounty hunter Embo had a pet Anuba, and many Sand People tribes kept Anubas as well, alongside mastiffs, a similar species native to Geonosis that had been imported to Tatooine. A few medium-sized Tatooine creatures were also capable of flight. Among these were the reptilian, dragonfly-like Sketos, which fed on the blood of large animals, and the brightly coloured Reptavian Urusai, which had 2 to 4 wings, long tails, and primarily ate carrion. Others burrowed, either through the dunes or through rock, as was the case for the cliff borer worms. Cliff borer worms were arthropods that burrowed through the rocks of Tatooine's uplands, feeding on lichen and razor moss. Adult cliff borers had hardened hides, which were harvested by the settlers for use in making boots and armor. Slightly larger than most womp rats, Zuka boars roamed the remote uplands of Tatooine. These creatures were herbivores, primarily feeding on the grasses, mosses, and lichens that grew in the upland's rocky crags, but they had sharp tusks and could be fearsome when provoked. The same was true for the Woodoos, one of the most absurd-looking Tatooine creatures, which were 3-meter-tall Reptavians that lived as scavengers out in the deserts. Woodoos had large, egg-shaped bodies covered in thick feathers which kept them cool in the heat of the Dune Sea. They also had large heads with blue skin and sharp beaks, as well as claws on their stubby feet. Woodoos were intelligent, fairly long-lived creatures with complex social habits. They were flightless despite possessing small vestigial wings and too slow to hunt, though their beaks and claws could do some damage to any creature that threatened a Woodoo up close. Woodoos were primarily scavengers, feeding on carrion and the eggs of other creatures. Several of Tatooine's more docile species were domesticated by the planet's sentient peoples, used as mounts or as beasts of burden, and some were even exported to other planets. 4 of these species were the most well-known: Eopes, Rontos, Dewbacks, and Banthas. Eopes were docile, cameloid herbivores with flexible snouts and tough, pale skin. They were stubborn but reliable, able to carry heavy loads over long distances. The settlers sometimes milked them or butchered them for meat, but most of the time, Eopes were used as beasts of burden. The same was true for the Rontos, a species of large, quadrupedal mammals known for their strength and loyalty to their owners. Rontos had thick grey skin and long necks, and though they were herbivores, their size and strength meant that few predators dared to mess with them, with the notable exception of the mighty Krayt dragon. Rontos had poor vision and were easily startled by machines or sudden movements, but they had keen senses of smell and hearing. Rontos were easy to domesticate and frequently used as mounts or beasts of burden, especially by the Jawas. Rontos were used less by Tatooine settlers, who favoured Eopes as beasts of burden and Dewbacks as mounts. Dewbacks were large, 4-legged lizards that were as strong and easily domesticatable as the Ronto, but they were much less skittish. Some Dewbacks lived solitary lives, but others moved in small packs, wandering the desert in search of food. Dewbacks were omnivores, feeding on desert sage and other flora alongside scurriers and young womp rats. Dewbacks were cold-blooded and became sluggish at night, with dewback packs often huddling together for warmth. Dew would collect on their backs overnight, hence their names, and the dewbacks consumed this dew as a primary source of water. Dewbacks only bred in the canyons of the Junlan wastes, and their breeding habits were so ingrained that it was impossible to breed them off-world, but dewbacks were such reliable beasts of burden that they were often exported for off-world use anyway. The last beast of burden native to Tatooine was the bantha, a large, hairy mammal that wandered the Dune Sea in herds. Banthas were hardy, social, and very intelligent, with long, shaggy coats of heat-regulating fur and thick horns. Banthas were herbivores and had long, prehensile tongues which they used to dig up desert plants. Banthas were known for their distinctive, unpleasant smell, which was matched only by the fodder that domesticated banthas ate as their primary food source, a highly pungent mixture of local plants and fungi. Tatooine settlers sometimes used banthas as beasts of burdens or as mounts, but most often they domesticated banthas for their meat or milk. The Sand People had a special bond with banthas, which they considered sacred animals. These large animals were some of the biggest on Tatooine, but as a wise Jedi once said, there's always a bigger fish, and all 4 of these beasts of burden were preyed upon by Tatooine's largest predators. These included the sand bats, a species of flying, leathery-winged pack hunters who traveled in large groups. Sandbat venom was deadly to humans and caused excruciating pain, and Sand People often used it to poison the spikes on their gaffy sticks. There were also skicks, a rare species of large, vicious predatory lizards that stalked the remote wastes of Tatooine, and the Raid, a species of burly reptilian predators that could be found in the deserts south of Anchorhead. Tatooine Raid came in several subspecies, including ordinary desert raid, tougher Hulak Raid, and the rare fearsome dune claws. All of these subspecies had large heads, sharp teeth and claws, and highly muscular front legs, as well as much smaller rear legs. They traveled in packs of 2 to 6 and could be ferocious foes, bounding toward predators and prey alike to attack with their long front claws. Raid were once common in the southern Dune Sea, preying on the banthas and dewbacks that lived there, but their numbers were greatly reduced by hunters, as Raid were popular targets for less experienced trophy hunters due to the dense bone plates in their heads, which had niche medical uses and were thus very valuable. Perhaps the most infamous of Tatooine's predators was the fearsome krayt dragon, a reptomammal that was one of the largest creatures on the planet. These monsters came in 2 subspecies, the smaller and more common canyon krayt dragon and the more elusive greater krayt dragon. Canyon krayts lived in the highlands and were about 30 meters long, with 4 legs, long forked tails, and sharp horns, teeth, and claws, the latter of which could rend durasteel. They were covered in blast-resistant scales, and there was only a single weak point in their armor, the dragon's sinus cavity. Greater krayts, meanwhile, could grow up to 100 meters long, and they needed 10 to 16 legs to support their enormous bulk. These monsters lived out in the open desert and swam under the sands of the Dune Sea, though, like the canyon krayt, they used large cave systems in the highlands as their lairs. Both varieties of krayt dragon preyed primarily on banthas, but also on other large beasts, and they both swallowed boulders to store in their gizzards to grind down food. The dragon's stomach acid refined these boulders into krayt dragon pearls, one of the most priceless treasures in the galaxy. The only predator on Tatooine that hunted these mighty beasts was the even rarer sand demon, a species of 6-legged, clawed insect with incredibly thick exoskeletons and a fearsome temper. Like greater krayts, sand demons swam through the sands of the Dune Sea, and they preyed on most of Tatooine's fauna, including canyon krayts. The sarlacc that dwelled in the Great Pit of Carkoon, which wasn't native to Tatooine but was well established in the ecosystem of the northern Dune Sea, also occasionally ate canyon krayts. Neither sand demons nor sarlaccs could challenge the greater krayt dragon, however, which was even known to prey upon sarlaccs from time to time. Now it's time to move on to Tatooine's intelligent life forms, beginning with the more fearsome of its 2 indigenous sentient species, the Sand People. The Sand People, along with their planetary neighbors, the Jawas, were the descendants of the ancient Kumamgar, the original indigenous sentients of Tatooine. Most of the Kumamgar were killed when the Rakata razed the planet, but a few populations survived in strongholds deep underground. By the time their distant descendants emerged from their caves, they diverged into 2 species, the Jawas and the Gorfas, the latter of whom later became known as the Sand People. Following their emergence from the caves, the Gorphas, as they were then known, became a nomadic people, spending the next thousands of years roaming the habitable region, coming to terms with their new identity and their new desert homeworld. The Sand People referred to this part of their history as the Long Walk, and it ultimately ended with the Gorphas diverging into tribes before settling down and forming sedentary societies, which settled primarily in caves that contained reliable aquifers. But the arrival of the first of Tatooine settlers upended the Gorphas' way of life, cutting off their water sources and uprooting their tribes. The Gorphas became nomadic once more, and between 5000 and 4000 BBY, their society made up its final transformation into the Sand People culture we know from the modern era. Around the time of the films, these people were known primarily by two names, the Sand People and the Tusken Raiders. It's sometimes assumed that the name Sand People was an insult applied by the settlers while they were properly known as the Tuskens, but it's actually the other way round. The name Tusken Raiders refers to a settler outpost the Sand People destroyed, while the name Sand People was fairly close to how these beings thought of themselves as people of the desert who lived in harmony with the sands of their home. The name the Sand People called themselves is unknown, while the Jawas called them horned ghosts or the giants of the sand. We've stuck to calling them the Sand People thus far, and we're going to keep doing so going forward. The Sand People were humanoids, and biologically speaking, they were very similar to humans. Indeed, one of the reasons they hated the human settlers so much was because they believed the humans looked like the ancient Kumamga, and this resemblance reminded the Sand People of their ancestors' ancient sins. With that said, Sand People and humans weren't genetically compatible, so there were at least some biological differences between the two. The specifics of Sand People biology were largely unknown, however. In Sand People culture, it was forbidden to expose any part of the flesh, and as a result, just their basic physical appearance was a mystery. Nonetheless, in most respects, the Sand People had very similar capabilities to humans, though they were a little tougher and had a higher tolerance for heat and hardship. The Sand People lived in nomadic tribes and clans which wandered the deserts and uplands of Tatooine's habitable region. They were somewhat xenophobic, with a fierce hatred of the planet settlers and even the Jawas. Despite this, the Sand People were known to adopt outsiders into their tribes. A number of Sand People were actually humans taken in raids as children who were raised in the customs of the Sand People. The language of the Sand People was guttural and had an animalistic sound, but it was deceptively complex and difficult for most non-Sand People to understand or master. It had no corresponding written language. Tatooine's planetary government estimated that Sand People made up 5% of the planet's population of 200,000, which would mean there were only about 10,000 Sand People on the entire planet. This estimate was likely a major undercount, as most Sand People's tribes roamed the remote fringes of the habitable region, far from the settlers' towns. The specific customs of the Sand People varied from tribe to tribe, but they were all based on one shared culture and way of life. All of the Sand People tribes were nomadic, and their migrations took them all across Tatooine's habitable region. Each tribe followed its own specific migration patterns, which usually wound through the Dune Sea between upland regions. Many Sand People tribes had migration patterns that led through the Junlan wastes. During sandstorm season, large numbers of tribes would camp in the wastes, particularly in the southern subregion known as the Needles. Some Sand People tribes roamed through Tatooine's settled lands, where they routinely came into conflict with the settlers. Others kept to the shifting sands of the Dune Sea, living far from the settlers and avoiding them whenever possible. Sand People tribes occasionally battled over territory or banded together under powerful warlords, but this was uncommon. The Sand People were hunter-gatherers, with most tribes subsisting primarily on water from oases and underground aquifers. Hubbergords gathered from rock crags in the upland regions and the meat of large animals their warriors hunted. The hunting grounds and their water reservoirs of some tribes were stolen or destroyed by the settlers, however, and these tribes compensated for their losses by raiding settlements and moisture farms, taking food, beasts of burden, and stores of water, as well as prisoners and other trophies. Though the Sand People hated many kinds of advanced technology for reasons we'll discuss shortly, some tribes also made use of moisture evaporators to make up for the loss of natural aquifers. Sand People hunted not only for sport, but for honor. Young warriors proved themselves by hunting Tatooine's most dangerous beasts, or by hunting settlers, the most dangerous beasts of all. The Sand People killed or captured dewbacks, raid, and settlers for various rituals and traditions, the most gruesome of which was the blood rite, in which a young warrior would torture their prey to death over the course of weeks. The greatest of Sand People warriors strived to slay krayt dragons, the mightiest of Tatooine's predators, and retrieve krayt dragon pearls from their gizzards. This was rarely accomplished, and the Sand People generally feared krayt dragons and avoided them when not in the hunt. The warrior responsible was hailed as being among the tribe's greatest. Sand People clans were usually on the small side, consisting of 20 to 30 individuals, while tribes were larger. Sand People tribes were typically led by a chieftain or war chief, usually the strongest warrior of the tribe. Every tribe also contained a single storyteller, the keeper of the tribe's legends, rituals, and oral history. Tribes typically lived in temporary mobile camps, living in tents made of sticks and hides, though some tribes lived in larger, semi-permanent fortified enclaves. In some tribes, male and female Sand People had different roles in the tribe, with males being hunters and warriors, and females tending to the camp and taking care of the children. Other Sand People tribes, and many of the smaller clans, didn't have these roles, and both males and females did a bit of both. In any case, the hunters and warriors often roamed abroad for long periods of time, and as a result, those who remained at camp had to know how to fend for themselves, making all Sand People capable warriors. Sand People children, known as Ulia in their language, were considered genderless until they came of age at 15. At all times, all Sand People wore tan-colored desert wrappings which left no skin exposed. These kept the wearers cool in the desert heat and also doubled as camouflage. The Sand People considered them sacred. Sand People often wore additional belts, bandoliers, and/or backpacks over their tunics to carry supplies, and their head wrappings incorporated goggles and face masks, the former to protect their eyes from the harsh glare of the suns, and the latter to filter sand out of the air they breathed. Ornamental horns were often incorporated into their head wrappings as well, while moisture traps worn around the neck humidified the air taken in through their masks. In some tribes, female Sand People dressed somewhat differently, incorporating large, ornate metal masks and more refined decorative cloaks into their attire, sometimes ornamented with scraps of metal or the tusks of womp rats. Sand People children wore unisex outfits that incorporated aspects of both male and female dress. For all Sand People, removing these wrappings was forbidden, except under very specific circumstances. Showing even the slightest bit of skin was punished in most tribes with exile or even death, as it was considered a disgrace to the entire tribe. Sand People could only remove their wrappings in the privacy of their own tents, and only when alone. The only times they were allowed to remove their wrappings in front of others was during childbirth, during coming of age rituals, on their wedding nights, and when alone with their mates. The Sand People domesticated several kinds of animals. Dog-like Anubas and Mastiffs were domesticated for use as guard animals in their camps, where they would assist the women of the tribe in defense against attackers. Most famously, however, the Sand People also domesticated Banthas, which they used as mounts or beasts of burden and viewed as sacred animals. At the age of 7, each member of the tribe would be paired with a Bantha of the same age, and the two would become companions for life. Banthas were even involved in Sand People marriage ceremonies, which involved blood rituals undertaken by the bride, the groom, and their banthas. When Sand People couples sought to have children, their banthas would mate as well, and the resultant calf would often be the same sex as the couple's child. The Sand People used their banthas as mounts and beasts of burden, riding them single file into battle or on their nomadic wanderings, and they developed close bonds with their banthas, such that banthas would often kill themselves if their riders were slain. If a rider's bantha were killed, the rider would exile themselves, walking off into the desert alone. The Sand People believed that if the spirit of the rider's mount willed it, the rider would be able to tame a new bantha and then return to the tribe. If not, they would die in the desert. The Sand People were fierce and cunning warriors who knew how to use the environment to their advantage in combat. They were territorial and attacked any who trespassed their territory without showing the proper respect, and many tribes had ancient blood feuds with Tatooine settlers, which drove them to attack outlying farms and even small towns. Since ancient times, their weapon of choice was the Gadafi, a short, two-handed battle staff with a spiked club on one end and another spike ringed with blades on the other. Gaffi sticks, as they were colloquially called, were made from whatever salvage was at hand, and each one was as unique as the warrior that made it. Gadafi were highly versatile melee weapons, and their tips were often poisoned with sandbat venom to inflict maximum pain. They were also occasionally used as tools for tasks such as cleaning the teeth of their owner's bantha. After the arrival of the settlers, Sand People also started to make use of more modern weapons. The most well-known of this was the cycler rifle, a type of slug thrower which fired magnetically accelerated slugs encased in a cocoon of energy. Cycler rifles were long-range, bolt-action weapons, primitive but very effective and easy to maintain. Due to their marauding ways, the Sand People were seen by the settlers as little more than animals in human form, bloodthirsty savages, one and all. Of course, this was just cultural misunderstanding. The Sand People were perfectly reasonable when treated with respect, and their hostility toward outsiders was the result of aggression on the settlers' part. To fully understand why though, we need to get into the Sand People culture a little. The core of Sand People culture was a mythologized version of history which was passed down to each generation by the storyteller of each tribe. Storytellers were trained for their role from birth, made to memorize the entire history of their tribe and the Sand People as a whole. Upon completing this task, an apprentice would become the new storyteller, and the old storyteller would go off into the desert to die. This training regimen was no simple task. The Sand People had great reverence for their history and insisted on keeping it oral, believing that writing it down would remove it from the people and thus cheapen it. But they also insisted that the history only ever be recounted perfectly, without alteration or mistakes. Speaking the history in error, a sin that could range from trying to reinterpret the history or messing up even a single word, was a blasphemy punishable by death. This brutal system meant that only a few of those Sand People who trained to be storytellers lived long enough to take on that position. However, it also ensured the Sand People's history maintained a degree of accuracy, giving the Sand People an accurate cultural memory of events 25,000 years in the past. We already recounted the history of the Sand People much earlier in this video, and as we said then, this version of Tatooine's history was largely accurate, if a bit mythologized. How the Sand People mythologized this history, however, was key to understanding their culture. As the Sand People saw it, the occupation and bombardment of Tatooine had been punishment for the sins of their ancestors. The Kumumga, the Sand People believed, had lived apart from the land, and the builders had been sent to punish them for their arrogance, taking away the worst offenders as slaves and destroying the surface of Tatooine. Those who remained emerged from the caves, determined never to repeat these sins. Though all that remained of their homeworld was sand, they were determined that the sand would not be misused, and that going forward, they would live in harmony with the land. The Sand People believed that they were part of the land and strove to live with it rather than raising themselves above it like the settlers and their ancient ancestors did. For this reason, they took great care to preserve the natural environment of Tatooine and reacted violently to all who would desecrate it. Their connection with the land was also why the Sand People rejected many forms of advanced technology. They believed that such machines cheapened life by removing the struggle from it, and that this also severed a connection with the land. They especially hated speeders and other forms of artificial transportation, which made them apart from the land physically as well as spiritually. They believed that respect for the land demanded that they always maintain direct contact with it by traveling on foot or on the backs of sacred animals. On the whole, Sand People lived their simple lives by choice. They believed it to be the best way to avoid the sins of their ancestors and maintain respect for what remained of Tatooine. As a result of their beliefs, the Sand People viewed the settlers in much the same way as the settlers viewed them, as murderous savages with no respect for the land or its rightful owners. They lived apart from the land, tearing up the desert for profit with their unholy machines, invading the ancestral lands of the Sand People and driving them away. The Sand People saw the settlers as being much like their ancient abducted, and they hated them for this. This hatred, bolstered by many massacres the settlers had carried out over the years, eventually led to a long-standing blood feud. But enough about the Sand People for now. It's time to talk about Tatooine's other indigenous sentients, the Jawas. The Jawas, like the Sand People, were believed to be the descendants of the ancient Kumamga, but this isn't entirely certain. Some anthropologists instead believe that the Jawas had evolved on another planet before migrating to Tatooine in the distant past, though after it was transformed into a desert, some Jawa clans seem to believe something similar, though the difficulty of translating Jawese means that this could just be a misinterpretation. Other research suggested that the Jawas might have been descended from humans somehow. Nonetheless, the Kumamga theory was the dominant one. If the Jawa were descendants of the Kumamga, their anatomy diverged considerably from their ancient ancestors. Jawas were short and rodent-like, gaunt and generally not very strong. Their faces were shrunken and had beady eyes, and their bodies were covered in tufts of black hair. Jawas had a high body heat, a strong immune system, and rapid metabolism, and they had incredibly strong body odor that most non-Jawas found repulsive, which was intensified by the fact that Jawas considered bathing to be a waste of water. This natural stench was used for communication by the Jawas, who had extremely acute senses of smell, which they could use to determine a Jawa's identity, mood, physical condition, lineage, maturity, arousal, and the last meal from their body odor alone. Jawas could subsist solely on hubba gourds due to their highly efficient digestive systems, but they also ate a number of other foods for variety, including the meat of several Tatooine animals. Apart from their strong senses of smell, Jawas also had particularly keen night vision. Much like the Sand People, the Jawas wore long, loose-fitting desert robes that covered their whole bodies at all times, except for their hands. The Jawas didn't have the same taboos against exposed skin as the Sand People, but they still usually kept everything except their hands covered for protection against Tatooine's harsh climate. Jawa robes were brown and hooded, and they were designed to protect Jawas from the heat of the suns. They were also coated in a special solution that allowed them to trap moisture, which helped Jawas avoid dehydration. Jawas often wore tool belts or bandoliers over their robes, and under their hoods, they wore black cloth shrouds that obscured their faces. These shrouds prevented moisture loss, and the Jawas implanted polished gemstones into them to act as goggles, protecting the Jawas' sensitive eyes from Tatooine's unforgiving twin suns. These gemstones were usually orange or red, and they appeared to glow in the reflected light of the suns. They were sometimes mistaken for the Jawas' eyes. The Jawas spoke a complex, highly variable language known as Jawese. Jawese was notoriously hard to understand, both because Jawas spoke it extremely quickly and because it was partly scent-based. Jawas' scent added tone and several layers of meaning to Jawese, and without it, the language was just a collection of meaningless syllables. Jawas also had a trade language for communication with outsiders, however, which was a variant of Jawese that was exclusively verbal. The Jawa trade language was clunky and hard to understand, but it could be learned and spoken by non-Jawas. Most of Tatooine settlers could speak enough of the Jawa trade language to barter with them, and a number of Jawese words and phrases made it into the local jargon. The name Tatooine, in fact, was derived from the Jawese name from the planet, which was Tatooine. Jawas had a largely communal culture based around scavenging, originally for food, and later mostly for pieces of abandoned technology. Jawas lived in large clans, which were led by several clan chiefs and a shaman. Each clan was based in a settlement from which the clan would dispatch bands of scavengers on a regular basis. Clan chiefs were male and oversaw the clan's scavenger bands, leaving with them on expeditions, while the clan shaman was female and stayed home in the settlement. The shaman ruled the whole clan, and she could be chosen for various reasons. Some were chosen for being force-sensitive, others were chosen for having visions or unexpectedly overcoming childhood illnesses, and still others were just chosen by the current shaman to be her successor. The Jawas believed their shamans had magical powers, which the shamans used to perform spells to bless the clan and keep it safe. Shamans were also believed to be able to see the future, and they were often consulted for their wisdom by other Jawas. Apart from the shamans though, Jawa society was mostly patriarchal, with most of the power in any given clan held by males. Originally, Jawa clans were nomadic, but this left them vulnerable to the beasts of the desert, as well as to the sand people, who often kidnapped Jawas for use as slaves. Over time, the Jawas thus shifted toward a more sedentary lifestyle, with clans establishing settlements, usually heavily fortified ones, high in the mountains, from which they dispatched bands of scavengers to roam around, gather food and salvage, and haul them back to the settlement. The clans mostly kept to themselves. Each clan had its own designated salvaging territory, and they preferred to keep out of each other's way. Once per year, however, all the Jawa clans would send out representatives to a swap meet in the Dune Sea. During the annual Great Swap Meet, the clans would trade and exchange salvage, and the clan chiefs would take the opportunity to meet and deal with inter-clan diplomacy. This involved exchanging navigational data and arranging inter-clan marriages to maintain the Jawas' cultural and genetic diversity. The Jawas treated marriages like business arrangements, with the clans of the bride and the groom haggling until they reached an agreeable deal. One of the two partners would become a member of their spouse's clan, and in exchange, their original clan would be given a favorable trade agreement or a shipment of salvage. Unlike the culture of the Sand People, which stubbornly resisted as much outside influence as possible, Jawa culture was heavily shaped by the waves of settlers that came to Tatooine. In the early days of settlement on Tatooine, some Jawas resented the settlers, but unlike their larger cousins, the Jawas weren't hostile to them. Instead, all but a few Jawas saw the settlers as a valuable business opportunity. They traded with and scavenged for each successive generation of settlers, adopting their technology into their way of life. Eventually, the resentment some Jawas held toward the settlers faded and then vanished entirely. This earned the Jawas the ire of the Sand People, who began attacking Jawa clans and scavenger bands looking for slaves, but this only drove the Jawas further into the arms of the outsiders, from whom they now sought protection as well as trade. Before long, however, the Jawas became better equipped to protect themselves, as successive waves of settlers abandoned Tatooine and left their technologies for the Jawas to commandeer. This included sand crawlers, which completely transformed Jawa society. As we'll discuss more in a bit, most of Tatooine's early settlers were miners, and when they settled on the planet, they imported enormous mining vehicles to tear up the Dune Sea in search of ore deposits. These mining efforts all inevitably failed for the reasons we'll get into later, and when they did, these sandcrawlers were simply left behind in the desert as it wasn't cost effective to haul such massive vehicles off-world. Once abandoned, the sandcrawlers were commandeered by the Jawas, who transformed them into mobile fortresses from which scavenger bands could conduct their operations. After the departure of Czerka Corporation, sometime around 3900 BBY left the Jawas with their first sandcrawlers, the Jawas' fortunes began to improve. No longer would the Jawas be dependent on the settlers for protection, and no longer would Jawa scavenger bands be vulnerable to sand people attacks. Now, scavenger bands could work from the safety of these enormous machines, and while the sand people were capable of attacking and disabling sandcrawlers from time to time, they did so less frequently, as sandcrawlers weren't nearly as easy a target as Jawa bands had been previously. Additionally, as the sand people had regularly attacked sandcrawler convoys during mining operations, the machines had been modified to better withstand assault. The sandcrawlers used by the Jawas in the modern era, which were left by the Corellian Mining Corporation in 70 BBY, could withstand sand people attacks and even angry crate dragons. Sandcrawlers became mobile homes for entire Jawa salvage bands, with up to 300 Jawas living on each sandcrawler. The sandcrawlers' ore processing machinery was reconfigured to process salvage instead, and their storage holds were used for storing spare parts and lost droids. The Jawas rebuilt their whole culture around their sandcrawlers, which became the symbols of their clans, the place where most Jawas lived and worked for most of the year, only occasionally returning to their clan holds in the mountains. Jawa clan settlements were also transformed by interactions with the settlers. The Jawas used pieces of old, wrecked starships to create towering fortress walls around the perimeter of their clan holds, creating a mighty defensive perimeter that could even keep out crate dragons. These fortresses were located high in the mountains, with the only known Jawa mountain fortress being located in the Hubba Heights area of the northern Junlan wastes. Within their mountain fortresses, the Jawas serviced their sandcrawlers, kept their hordes of scrap and droids, and raised their children. Jawa females, including each clan's shaman, lived in the fortress year-round, while most adult Jawa males lived most of their lives in the sandcrawlers, returning to the fortresses only during the storm season, during which the sandcrawlers would be repaired, their salvage would be offloaded, and the scavengers would return to their families. As successive waves of settlers arrived on Tatooine, the Jawas slowly shifted from their original lifestyle of scavenging for food to scavenging for technology left out in the desert. This started mostly out of curiosity, but as the settlers became established, salvaging became a way of life for the Jawas, who found they could profit from the trade in scrap and droids, and then use their profits to buy food and water from the settlers, which was much easier than searching for food and water outright. Food and water were scarce on Tatooine, while wreckage from space battles and past settlement efforts was everywhere. The Jawas seemingly had a natural gift for salvaging too. They were very good at figuring out machinery and could get just about anything working again, at least for long enough to sell it. They also excelled at finding new and unorthodox uses for old technology, either to use themselves or to sell to the settlers. As a result, the settlers regularly traded with the Jawas, despite the sometimes dodgy reliability of their repair work. The relationship between the settlers and the Jawas wasn't perfect, with that said. The Jawas were also known to steal anything that wasn't tied down, often selling these stolen goods back to their owners. Because of this, Jawas were widely regarded as thieves, as well as clever mechanics and good scavengers. A label the Jawas were perfectly happy with, so long as the settlers kept buying their goods. The Jawas traded in all sorts of salvage, but they were most well known for salvaging, repairing, and selling droids, which the Jawas seemed to have a special knack for repairing or modifying. Some of the droids the Jawas sold were unique custom models designed and built by the Jawas. These monster droids typically combined parts from a slew of different droids in unorthodox ways, and they were highly valued by the settlers, as the Jawas custom built their monster droids to tailor to the settlers' needs. Other droids the Jawas stole were ordinary models found out in the desert or stolen from towns and moisture farms. Jawas often disabled these droids using ion blasters, affixed restraining bolts to them, and then hauled them off to their sandcrawlers before their owners even noticed they were missing. Official estimates claim that Tatooine's Jawa population was roughly as large as its population of sand people, being 5% of the planet's population, or 10,000 Jawas total. Like for the sand people, this was likely an undercount. Finally, let's talk about Tatooine's last population group, its settlers. Over the course of the Republic's final 5 millennia, various waves of settlers set up shop on Tatooine. Most of these waves were short-lived and unconnected with one another, but despite this, they all shared a few common characteristics. Each of the settlement waves started with miners looking to strike it rich, and then once the mining dried up, the miners were replaced with a collection of cynical moisture farmers and outlaws looking for a remote world to hide out on. The settlers invariably got involved in blood feuds with the Sand People, who despised them and fought turf wars with them, and they usually traded with the Jawas. Eventually, the last of the farmers and outlaws would pack up and leave, and before long, a new wave of settlers would arrive and the cycle would repeat. The first known wave of settlers arrived on Tatooine in 4200 BBY. The most recent wave of settlement on Tatooine began in 700 BBY, and the settlers who built the towns and farms we see in the films only arrived in 100 BBY. As we've said a few times now, Tatooine's government estimated the planet's population at 200,000 sentient beings, 90% of whom, or 180,000 people in total, were settlers. Humans made up the vast majority of the settler population, representing 70% of Tatooine's total known population. 10% were indigenous sand people or Jawas, while the remaining 20% consisted of non-native, non-humans of various species, prominently including Rhodians, Twi'leks, Aqualish, Bith, Hutts, Kironaks, and many others. These settlers primarily spoke Basic and Huttese, and through their well-trafficked spaceports, they imported water, foodstuffs, chemicals, metals, medical supplies, and high technology. Their only real exports were minerals and illegal goods. Most of Tatooine's towns and moisture farming communities were run by semi-formal local councils, who were the only real government most of the planet had. Officially, all of Tatooine Settlements answered to a planetary government based out of the planetary capital, the town of Bestine. But in practice, this government was mostly just ceremonial, and the other towns ran themselves. Law enforcement was scarce across the planet. Some towns and communities had informal militias, but these were mostly for protection against the Sand People. The only real centralized power on Tatooine was the Hutt cartel, specifically the Deslegic clan, whose leader, Jabba the Hutt, had his palace on Tatooine. The Republic never had any real presence on the planet, and though the Empire established a governorship on Tatooine and set up military bases in its spaceports, it never really controlled Tatooine either. This was something it should have seen coming. History proved that Tatooine was a planet that seemed naturally given to causing even the best plans to fall apart. Speaking of, let's get into the history of Tatooine settlements. The Tatoo system was first scouted by the Republic by 15,000 BBY, but as we said earlier, Tatooine was initially misclassified as a star, and as a result, it would be over 10,000 years before settlers first arrived on the planet. In 5,000 BBY, a massive space battle between unknown factions occurred over the planet. Nothing about the battle itself is known, but it littered Tatooine's deserts with the wreckage of destroyed capital ships, some of which the Jawas salvaged. The first settlers arrived sometime after this. Between 5,000 and 4,000 BBY, several waves of settlers arrived on Tatooine, set up initial settlements, and abandoned them. Many of these settlers established themselves on the same site, building and abandoning city after city in a place that later settlers would name Anchorhead. Each wave of settlers followed the same pattern. They would land on Tatooine, build a small town at Anchorhead, begin mining operations, abandon their mining operations, and then leave. When they left, they would leave equipment scattered all over the desert, and in the abandoned town of Anchorhead, which would crumble into ruins and be buried beneath the sand, The Jawas would then salvage the technology, refurbish it, and sell it to the next generation of settlers who would usually build over the buried ruins of Anchorhead, ignorant of previous settlement attempts. Years of sandstorms and harsh conditions would ensure that there was no sign of the previous settlers by the time the next generation arrived, and all of the early settler waves were obscure, weren't associated with the Republic, and were completely forgotten by galactic history. For the newer settlers, the only clues to Tatooine's full history were the old equipment the Jawas sold them and the fact that Jawas referred to Anchorhead as the Old City New. The first known wave of settlers arrived on Tatooine in 4200 BBY, though they were likely preceded by several other expeditions over the centuries. After they abandoned Tatooine, the planet was settled again around 4000 BBY. This next wave of settlers started out very small, and it was the first known wave to be associated with the Republic. This settler community was led by a Jedi Knight, Sidrona Diath, who also represented Tatooine in the Galactic Senate. He and his son, Dace Diath, were heroes of the Great Sith War. Both men perished in the war, however, and after their deaths, Tatooine was abandoned by the Republic and its latest settlers. It wasn't long before Tatooine was settled once again, however, this time by the Czerka Corporation, which was then the most powerful corporation in the galaxy. Shortly before the Mandalorian Wars, Czerka laid claim to Tatooine as a prospective mining world, as preliminary surveys had shown that the planet was rich in a variety of useful metal ores. They established themselves at Anchorhead, which they built up into a decently large city, the largest settlement ever built on Tatooine up to that point. There, the settlers established trade with the local Jawas, set up a spaceport, and fortified their new city against Sand People attacks. Czerka imported sand crawlers and a population of around 10,000 miners to Anchorhead, from which they began a massive mining operation, digging up the desert in search of ore. At first, the mining went well. The sand crawlers brought in huge loads of ore from the Dune Sea, and Czerka began refining it and shipping it off-world for use in manufacturing. But this didn't last long, and before long, Czerka discovered why the previous mining expeditions had failed. Tatooine metal had unusual magnetic properties that caused it to corrode extremely quickly. In the time it took to export off-world, the ore became completely unusable, leaving Czerka with a mining world that exported nothing but useless junk. This threw a wrench in Czerka operations on a galactic scale, as Czerka traders who conned other companies into buying Tatooine metal not only destroyed their own reputations, but that of Czerka itself. Czerka tried to cover up the uselessness of Tatooine metal in the hopes of making some profit from the mining operation, but word quickly got out. To make matters worse, the mining operation enraged the local Sand People tribes, who saw the Czerka as invaders and considered their mining activities a blasphemous desecration of the desert. The chieftain of one local tribe declared war on the corporation, and his warriors began killing settlers on sight. This forced Czerka to spend even more money and resources defending mining operations that weren't making any profit. Czerka continued mining for as long as it could con buyers into paying them for garbage, but before long, the Anchorhead settlement had to resort to other methods of earning revenue in order to stay afloat. It sponsored the establishment of a Tatooine swoop racing circuit, which was run by Motta the Hutt, subsidized the establishment of moisture farms outside Anchorhead, and also brought in hunters from across the galaxy, enticing them to Tatooine with stories of its fearsome krayt dragons. Around the time of the Jedi Civil War, Czerka also began paying headhunters to start killing Sand People in the hopes of decreasing the frequency of their raids. In 3956 BBY, they even tried to recruit the amnesiac Jedi Revan to kill the local chieftain and as much of his tribe as he could. Revan instead enlisted the translation services of HK-47 to negotiate with the Sand People, convincing the chieftain to decrease his tribe's attacks in exchange for a set of moisture evaporators. These measures kept Anchorhead afloat for a little while. The racers and hunters brought new sources of profit as they typically spent their money in Czerka Corporation stores, and the reduction in Sand People attacks eased pressure on the settlement as well. But this wasn't enough to make Tatooine financially worthwhile, especially when both new sources of profit started to dry up. The way Motto ran his swoop track kept Tatooine off the official galactic circuit, and overhunting quickly devastated the population of several local species, making hunting less viable. Czerka was ultimately left with no choice but to abandon Anchorhead, leaving the city to crumble into ruins and be buried under the shifting sands. The sand crawlers and other equipment the corporation left behind were commandeered by the Jawas, and the rest was history. During the Galactic Wars, a few minor waves of settlers set up shop on Tatooine, and both the Republic and Sith Empire established minor bases on the planet, including near the small town of Mos Eisley. But these were soon abandoned, and Tatooine was forgotten again, this time for a long while. Before or during the New Sith Wars, Tatooine dropped off official Republic charts, and there were no further settlement waves for close to 2,000 years. This dry spell lasted until 1100 BBY, near the end of the New Sith Wars, when the Republic rediscovered Tatooine. After the war's end, the Republic officially declared Tatooine open for settlement, along with a slew of other worlds all across the Outer Rim. Despite this, it would be centuries before anyone would actually try to settle Tatooine again, and when they did, the Republic had no involvement in their settlement efforts. In 700 BBY, the first settlers in well over 2,000 years came to Tatooine. These weren't miners, but monks of the Bomar Order who built a monastery on a bluff overlooking the northern Dune Sea. These eccentric monks kept to themselves in their sprawling fortress, content to ignore the outside world and be ignored by it while they sought enlightenment, which, to the Bomar monks, involved having their brains removed from their bodies and placed in nutrient jars. For around a century, the monks were the only settlers on Tatooine, but this didn't last. In around 600 BBY, another group of miners showed up, and among them was a man named Alcara. Alcara was originally an anthropologist working for the Tatooine Bureau of Ethnicity and Socialization, and his job was to study the Sand People, learning as much as possible about their culture, language, and traditions. In around 550 BBY, however, Alcara abandoned his post to become a bandit, amassing a following of thieves and outlaws who began preying on the other settlers. In his early raids, Alcara and his followers allied with a tribe of Sand People who they enlisted to completely wipe out a local police garrison. Shortly after this attack, however, the treacherous bandit and his followers betrayed and massacred their Sand People allies on the Great Mesra Plateau. Word of this massacre quickly spread to all Sand People tribes, who were enraged and declared a blood feud against Alcara, his followers, and all other settlers on Tatooine. This blood feud continued to the time of the Empire, being the root of the long-running conflict between the Sand People and the most recent group of settlers. On the run from both the law and the Sand People, Alcara and his followers hid out in the Bomar Monastery, which they claimed as their fortress. The monks didn't really care, and they were few enough that there was plenty of space for them and the bandits, who ignored the monks in turn. Alcara renovated and greatly expanded parts of the palace, adding on a tower, dungeons, and underground vaults, which the monks generally approved of. For the next 30-odd years, Alcara and his gang used the palace as their base of operations, from which they set out to raid moisture farms and mining convoys. In 516 BBY, however, Alcara and his followers were driven out by Jabba the Hutt, a powerful crime lord of the Desligic clan, who wanted to claim the monastery for his own. Alcara was driven off Tatooine and died soon after, and his fortress monastery became Jabba's palace, the Hutt cartel's base of operations on Tatooine. Jabba's henchmen further modified the monastery, reinforcing its walls against aerial bombardment, adding battlements and weapons emplacements to its perimeter, and constructing new underground sections, expanding on what Alcara's followers had built. Like Alcara, Jabba let the monks hang around, and even encouraged them to roam the palace, as he knew most beings found the sight of their disembodied brains in jars walking around on droid legs disconcerting. With Jabba's arrival, Tatooine became a part of the Hutt's sphere of influence. Jabba made Tatooine the headquarters of his criminal empire, and as he grew more powerful within Clan Desligic, Tatooine became increasingly important to the Hutts. Clan Basadi, Clan Deslogic's rival, also established operations on Tatooine at one point, with Gardula the Hutt building her own palace and criminal empire there. However, Gardula's operations didn't last, and most of the planet continued to answer to Jabba. When Jabba became the leader of Clan Deslogic, Tatooine became the headquarters for the whole clan, with Jabba's palace becoming one of the Hutt cartel's most important bases. In the centuries after Jabba set up shop on Tatooine, settlement efforts on the planet slowly expanded. The mining operation Al-Qara had originally been attached to dried up, but some of the settlements the miners had established endured, including several communities of moisture farmers. A few centuries after Jabba set up shop on Tatooine, Mos Espa and a few other towns were established in Tatooine's north by a group of Rodian refugees, and in 100 BBY, a new wave of settlers greatly increased the planet's population. These were human colonists from Bestine 4, whose ship, the Dawaga Queen, crash-landed south of the Great Mesra Plateau. Some of the survivors of the crash built a town around the wreckage, which became Mos Eisley, while other survivors headed west, where they founded the town of Bestine, named after their original homeworld. Several more settlements were built shortly thereafter, including Fort Tuscan, which was built in 98 BBY, and Anchorhead, which was re-established for the final time in 93 BBY. Named after an island on Bestine 4, Fort Tuscan was built in the remote, far northern reaches of the Junlan Wastes. Originally, the settlement thrived, but 3 years after it was built, it was subjected to a series of brutal raids by the Sand People, who ultimately razed the fort and drove its inhabitants out, earning themselves the name Tuscan Raiders. Soon after this latest wave of settlers established themselves, the Corellian Mining Corporation set up shop on Tatooine, establishing several more settlements and importing sandcrawlers for use in mining operations. They brought many settlers with them, but as with the Czerka Corporation, the CMC fared poorly on Tatooine due to the low quality of the planet's metal. In 70 BBY, the Corellian Mining Corporation, which was the last known corporation to attempt mining operations on Tatooine, abandoned the planet, leaving its sandcrawlers to the Jawas and abandoning its miners. But this time, Tatooine settlements didn't dry up when the CMC left. The miners just became moisture farmers or moved into the planet's towns, which became increasingly large and numerous as more and more settlers moved to Tatooine. Some came looking for quiet lives as moisture farmers, while others came as refugees or as employees of the Hutt cartel, settling in on the planet's spaceports. Mos Espa became a major hub of pod racing, attracting racers and race aficionados alike for the Boonta Eve Classic. In any event, by the time of the Clone Wars, Tatooine had a larger settler population than ever before, and this time, the settlers were here to stay, to the approval of the Jawas and the outrage of the Sand People. As we mentioned earlier, Tatooine's recent wave of settlers built their towns and farms primarily in a large desert basin between the Great Mesra Plateau and the Junlan Wastes. This region was safer than most of Tatooine, with slightly cooler temperatures and a few oases, and fewer Sand People tribes. To the north and east of this region was Jabba's palace and other Hutt strongholds on the edge of the northern Dune Sea, while to the west was the Junlan Wastes, home to ruins, the scattered homes of hermits and outlaws, a Jawa mountain fortress, several Sand People tribes, and a number of old space wrecks. Many of Tatooine's settlers lived on private moisture farms. These were scattered all over the place. Some were located far from any other settlements, while others were grouped up into communities, with the largest being the Great Chott Salt Flat community near Anchorhead in the south. The latter community included the Lars and Darklighter homesteads, as well as Tosh Station. Matesta, located near Unthout in the Matesta Oasis, was another major farming community, as well as the fourth oldest continuously inhabited settler community on Tatooine. Moisture farmers used moisture evaporators to collect water from Tatooine's parched atmosphere, which they used to grow food in hydroponic gardens. It was a hard life, but a family of moisture farmers could nonetheless live self-sufficiently, selling excess water or food in Tatooine's towns for a little extra cash. The typical moisture farm was largely built underground, with only a few poor stone entry domes, moisture evaporators, and a ring of perimeter sensors on the surface. Each farm nonetheless required a lot of land for the vaporators, which needed to be spaced at least 250 meters from each other for optimal performance. Each of these vaporators could produce 1.5 liters of water per day. Some of this water was used directly by the farmers, while the rest went to hydroponic gardens in the underground section of the farm, which kept the farm's occupants fed. Tatooine's moisture farmers typically kept to themselves, wanting little to do with the scum and villainy that thrived in many of the planet's towns. The southernmost of these towns was Anchorhead, which was a shadow of what it had once been. Formerly a city of 10,000 and the largest settlement on Tatooine, Anchorhead in the modern era was a small town with just 700 inhabitants. It was the hub of the local moisture farming communities, the place where the farmers sold their produce, acquired supplies, and hung out. The nearest large settlement was a legendary colony of Kirinak, which lay to the north and east, whose existence was kept a closely guarded secret by its inhabitants. Apart from the Kirinak colony, the nearest town was Mos Eisley. Mos Eisley Spaceport was Tatooine's largest city, located 80 kilometers north of Anchorhead and south of the Great Mesra Plateau. Located in a broad valley on the eastern side of the settled lands, Mos Eisley was a chaotic place, home to roughly 60,000 people, many of whom were involved in criminal activity in one way or another. Some of these inhabitants lived in townhouses on the surface, but most lived in underground complexes, which were cheaper to cool. The city was built around the wreck of the Dowager Queen, and it contained scores of commercial facilities, cantinas, and other establishments. The spaceport lacked a central hangar facility, instead containing 362 independently owned and operated docking rings, which were spread all across the city. Jabba the Hutt maintained a townhouse in Mos Eisley, and the Empire also established a small military base in the city during the Dark Times. All told, Mos Eisley was Tatooine's biggest hub of scum and villainy, as well as its most frequented port. The small towns of Alon and Wayfar were located just north of Mos Eisley, while the slightly larger towns of Arnthout and Bestein were located due west. Arnthout had a population of 350 people and was used primarily as a way station for travelers, while Bestein was the nominal planetary capital. Bestein had a population of around 1,000, and during the Imperial period, it was considered the safest city on Tatooine due to the presence of a large Imperial garrison and an Imperial planetary governor. Bestein's spaceport was a more legitimate and organized alternative to Mos Eisley, and the city also contained Tatooine's only university. In the far northwest of the settled lands was a shallow canyon known as the Zelric Draw, which divided the Mospic High Range and contained a series of ancient trade routes. The settlers used these to travel between Tatooine's southern cities and three major towns in the northwest, which lay in the foothills of the Mospic High Range. These three towns were Mos Entha, Mos Taik, and Mos Espa. Mos Taik and Mos Entha were minor spaceports. Mos Taik was smaller and more remote, while Mos Entha was larger and contained 75 docking bays. Mos Espa, however, was by far the largest of the three towns. Mos Espa controlled the trade routes through the Zelric Draw to the other two towns, and it grew fairly wealthy through its control of trade. It was Tatooine's second largest city and spaceport, second to Mos Eisley in both cases. Like Mos Eisley, Mos Espa was controlled by the Hutts, who oversaw this city's main attraction, its pod races, which operated out of the Mos Espa Grand Arena. Tatooine also hosted several other towns whose specific locations are unknown. Among these were Mos Gamos, a remote criminal's haven, Mos Zabu, a minor farming town, Mos Osno, a small spaceport, Mos Nitram, another remote town, and Mos Shuta, located on the far side of the western Dune Sea. During the waning years of the Galactic Republic, Tatooine existed just beyond the scope of the Republic's authority within the territory of the Hutt Cartel. During the Clone Wars, however, both the Republic and the CIS moved in on Tatooine, establishing minor military presences there at varying points in the war. After the end of the war, the Republic, now the Galactic Empire, stuck around on Tatooine. It formally annexed most of the Hutt's sphere of influence and claimed the entirety of the Arcanist sector, Tatooine included, as Imperial space. It installed a planetary governor at Bestein and military garrisons in Bestein and Mos Eisley to prove it, though Jabba the Hutt still maintained de facto control over the planet, something even the Imperials on Tatooine acknowledged. The Imperials tightened their grip on Tatooine after they failed to prevent the Millennium Falcon from escaping Mos Eisley just prior to the Battle of Yavin, a failure that led to the destruction of the first Death Star. Just a few years later, however, Tatooine's fortunes would change dramatically. In 4 ABY, Jabba the Hutt was killed in the Battle of the Great Pit of Carkoon, and shortly thereafter, the Emperor was killed aboard the second Death Star. The Empire promptly abandoned Tatooine, which soon joined the New Republic. With the death of Jabba, the planet's criminal underworld erupted into a bloody civil war, but this conflict ended when Jabba's relatives seized control of his holdings and re-established the Hutt presence on Tatooine. For the most part, the planet returned to business as usual after this, though under the New Republic, Tatooine did see a minor boost in prestige as it became known as the homeworld of the legendary Luke Skywalker, leading to an uptick in tourism. For the most part though, the more things changed, the more they stayed the same. Tatooine was Tatooine, and so long as the twin suns burned in the sky, it always would be. So that's our look at Tatooine, the most famous planet in Star Wars. We hope you enjoyed, and as always, we'd like to know what you think. Are there other planets you'd like to see us cover in such exhaustive detail? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.